Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I've studied the works of J.R.R. Tolkien for many, many years, for decades, in fact. And I'm the kind of guy that you can come and ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'll be able to come at you with a well-reasoned and well-researched answer. If you want to ask me a question, you can do so right in the comments section of this video, or in fact any video. But if you want to be featured in a video, if you want me to not just answer you quickly, but to do a whole thing and write up a whole article and then feature it in a video, there are two ways you can do that. The first is through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have relevant people with expertise or knowledge or wisdom or experience answer your question. And if you ask any sort of question about Tolkien on there, you're going to, after you submit the question, you're going to get a list of names of people that you could direct the question at, and you can select one or many, and just sort of see what you get, and my name will be at or near the top of that list. If you want to ask the question on YouTube, unfortunately this next part only works on the mobile app for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. It's not something that I've chosen, it's just the way that YouTube works. But on the mobile app, you just go to my channel and you click the button that says visit the community, and you can make a post there. And if you see your post get deleted, by the way, don't be concerned about that. As I'm answering them, I do delete them, so I write up the answers, and actually I post them on Quora, and then I do the video later, so I'm probably just doing a little house cleaning there. So anyway, guys, like the video, comment on the video, subscribe. If you see a hype button, click it. I think only members will wind up seeing that. Not sure if that actually does anything, but if you see the hype button, click it, and maybe we'll find out what it does. Anyway, that being said, I have 10 questions to get to you this time, and none of them are about myself, thankfully. I don't really like sitting here and talking about myself in these videos. I just felt that in the last episode it was warranted, considering how long I had been gone. I'm going to read to you. I do like to do a reading at the beginning of this, and we're going to have the quiz review at the end of the video. So if you've been taking the quizzes, that's going to be handled at the end of the video as well. So we're going to review the quizzes, reveal not only the answers, but how many people percentage-wise got each one right, and explain that a little bit. We're going to read from the Silmarillion, and I found this week that a lot of times I wound up having to come back to the second part of the Silmarillion. Now, the Silmarillion is sort of broken into really, several parts. There's pretty much four main parts. The first part is the Ainulindala, which is rather short. And the second part is Valaquenta, which is also rather short. The third part is Quenta Silmarillion, and that is there's actually 5 parts, not 4. Quenta Silmarillion is the bulk of the book, and then there's 2 more parts at the end, which are shorter, not as short, but as like Valaquenta and Ainulindala, for example, but they are shorter, and that is the Kalabeth and the Rings of Power. That being said, I found myself coming to Valaquenta quite a lot, so I think we should read a little bit of Valaquenta, especially since I got a lot of questions about the Maiar. So, let's see. Let's read the brief bit in here of the Maiar. And there's also of the enemies after that. I'll read that too, since they're both rather short. Of the Maia. With the Valar came other spirits whose being also began before the world, of the same order as the Valar, but of less degree. These are the Maiar, the people of the Valar, and their servants and helpers. Their number is not known to the elves, and few have names in any of the tongues of the children of Ilúvatar. For though it is otherwise in Aemon, in Middle-earth the Maiar have seldom appeared in form visible to elves and men. Chief among the Maiar of Valinor, whose names are remembered in the histories of the elder days, are Ilmara, the handmaid of Varda, and Eanwa, the banner-bearer and herald of Manwe, whose might in arms is surpassed by none in Arda. But of all the Maiar, Ossë and Uinen are best known to the children of Ilúvatar. Ossë is a vassal of Ulmo, and he is master of the seas that wash the shores of Middle-earth. He does not go into the deeps, but loves the coasts and the isles, and rejoices in the winds of Manwë, for in storm he delights, and laughs amid the roaring of the waves. His spouse is Uinen, the Lady of the Seas, whose hair lies spread through all waters under sky. All creatures she loves that live in the salt streams, and all weeds that grow there. To her mariners cry, for she can lay calm upon the waves, restraining the wildness of Ossë. The Númenorians lived long in her protection, and held her in reverence equal to the Valar. Melkor hated the sea, for he could not subdue it. It is said that in the making of Arda he endeavored to draw Ossë to his allegiance, promising to him all the realm and power of Ulmo if he would serve him. So it was long ago that there arose great tumults in the sea that wrought ruin to the lands. But Uinen at the prayer of Aule restrained Ossë and brought him before Ulmo, and he was pardoned, and returned to his allegiance, to which he has remained faithful. For the most part, for the delight in violence has never wholly departed from him, and at times he will rage in his wilfulness without any command from Ulmo his lord. Therefore those who dwell by the sea or go up in ships may love him, but they do not trust him. Melian was the name of a Maia who served both Vana and Esta. She dwelt long in Lorien, tending to the trees that flower in the gardens of Urmo, ere she came to Middle-earth. Nightingales sang about her wherever she went. Wisest of the Maia was Aloran. He too dwelt in Lorien, but his ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. Of Melian much is told in the Quenta Silmarillion, but of Aloran that tale does not speak. For though he loved the elves, he walked among them unseen, or in forms as one of them, and they did not know whence came the fair visions or the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. In later days he was a friend of all the children of Ilúvatar, and took pity on their sorrows, and those who listened to him awoke from despair, and put away the imaginations of darkness. Of the enemies, last of all is set the name of Melkor, he who arises in might. But that name he has forfeited, and the Noldor, who among the elves suffered most from his malice, will not utter it, and they name him Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. Great might was given to him by Ilúvatar, and he was coeval with Manwë. In the powers and the knowledge and all the other Valar he had part, but he turned them to evil purposes, and squandered his strength in violence and tyranny. For he coveted Arda, and all that was in it, desiring the kingship of Manwë and dominion over the realms of his peers. From splendor he fell through arrogance to contempt for all things save himself, a spirit wasteful and pitiless. Understanding he turned into subtlety in perverting to his own will all that he would use, until he became a liar without shame. He began with the desire of light, but when he could not possess it for himself alone, he descended through fire and wrath into a great burning down into the darkness, and darkness he used most in his evil works upon Arda, and filled it with fear for all living things. Yet so great was the power of his uprising that in ages forgotten he contended with Manwë and all the Valar, and through long years in Arda held dominion over most of the lands of the earth. But he was not alone, for of the Maiar many were drawn to his splendor in these days of greatness, and remained in that allegiance down to his darkness, and others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. Dreadful among these spirits were the Valorauka, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. Among those of his servants that have names the greatest was that spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthaur the Cruel. In this beginning he was the Maiar of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down the void. Here ends the Vala Quenta, which then goes into Quenta Silmarillion, which is the history of the Silmarils. But that's Vala Quenta, which is sort of the history of the powers. Most of that section is dedicated actually to the Valar, and it tells you sort of like each of them and their names and personality and deeds and such. And then there's this brief section about the Maiar, and this even briefer section about the enemies of the Valar. And it's interesting because of the Maiar being numerous, we have to assume that there are a great many more of them than there are Valar. But we don't know exactly how many, and we don't know many of their names. I think there's only like maybe less than a dozen names of Valar. There's some that we know of, like we know of some of the Balrogs, but we really only know the name of one of the Balrogs, which was, of course, Gothmog, and then there was another that was sort of given the title Durin's Bane, but that wasn't really a name, and we're never really told what any of their names were, before they fell into the darkness and joined, Melkor. And that's information that was never revealed. I mean, we learned Sauron's true name quite a bit later, not even in the Silmarillion, but in, I forget whether it was the, Parma Eldalamberin or the Vinya Tengwar, but it was one of the language journals that Tolkien wrote for, and in that was where he mentioned that Sauron's true name was Myron. Obviously, there was a lot about Usse and Ewinen, which is interesting because they're not, like, incredibly important to the story, but they're the ones that the elves know the most about. And it mentions, of course, Aloran. We know him as Gandalf, and I mentioned a few times in the video later that the Vala Quenta doesn't draw the exact connection between Aloran and the Mithrandir that is mentioned later in the Rings of Power section. So, but it does say that later he was, a friend to all the children of Iluvatar, so you get that hint of it there, and I think that, people who remember that Faramir had stated that Aloran was Gandalf's real name, they're going, oh, they're talking about Gandalf, and, but it's interesting because we don't know if the elves figured out that Aloran and Mithrandir were the same, but it certainly seemed that the elf that's writing this particular section knew of it, and we don't know. The Quenta Silmarillion probably in universe had a lot of different authors, and one translator being Bilbo, but the other sections around it, the Quenta Silmarillion is the bulk of the book, but it's preceded by Ainu Lindala and Vala Quenta, and then it's anteceded by Akalabeth and the Rings of Power, and I tend to think that, the Rings of Power was probably written by Elrond, and it's likely that he had a hand in the other sections as well. Certainly whoever wrote this really knew who Aloran was, even if they didn't want to write that down specifically, which gives us a few options. Elrond, Gil-galad, even Gil-galad wouldn't necessarily know that, because, unless Gandalf came earlier than we thought, which is possible, but not exactly probable. So yeah, really Elrond, Galadriel, Círdan, those are the three. I think, they all had a hand in writing some of the histories here, although probably not Galadriel as much as the other two, because Galadriel, you notice she's barely in it, and, Tolkien never really settled on an origin story for her, so she's always existing in the periphery as this really big major character who is an incredibly big force of good in Middle-earth. And he always wanted Galadriel to be this character that did a lot in the past, before The Lord of the Rings, but never really nailed it down. Of course, a lot of that is in Unfinished Tales. Anyway, we have 10 questions to get through, and these are some pretty exciting and interesting questions. So let's start with the first one. Our first question came in by the request of Ace Gang, who asks, if he had survived long enough, would Denethor's madness have subsided after the ring was destroyed? No, I don't think so. I find it to be doubtful that Denethor would ever really be made whole again. Perhaps he could find some respite, but he was a deeply, deeply traumatized person. Let's state that all of the events of the Return of the King happen in this scenario more or less the way that they do, excepting that Gandalf manages to get Denethor, get to him in time and maybe knock him out and then perhaps have him restrained for his own safety. I could make arguments back and forth about whether or not Aragorn would then become the king in this scenario. Denethor was 100% opposed to it, and in the end, it was essentially his decision. While there was at one point said to be a council of Gondor that would actually decide such matters, we aren't told at any point in The Lord of the Rings that they're still around and that they're making these decisions during the War of the Ring. And furthermore, they were shown to go along with the ruling stewards in the past. But let's ignore all that, and let's focus on the idea of Denethor's sanity. He was pretty far gone, and it had nothing to do with the One Ring, so the ring's destruction isn't exactly releasing him from anything. You could blame Denethor's loss of wits on Sauron, but it's not something that Sauron did to him with the ring, because he didn't have it at that time, and therefore he would not, this work would not be undone by the destruction of the ring. Furthermore, Denethor was a very strong man, and it takes more than just a little bit of taunting from Sauron to push someone with such a strong will over the edge to the point where he starts denying reality and doesn't believe what's in front of him, such as the fact that his son Faramir was still alive. Denethor still has to contend with just this pile of tragedies that he's been through, starting with, the very early death of his late wife, to seeing his country slowly lose a war over a span of decades, and his favorite person in the entire world, his son Boromir, died. And then he's faced with the possibility that Faramir may have died, and worse yet, the thought that he himself might have been complicit in it. And this is quite a lot for the old man to take on. So, then we have to get into his use of the Palantir, and that didn't help his psyche. And that was, before he contacted Sauron with it, the man was said to have grown old prematurely simply because he used the thing. If the war is won, he might at this point be in a better position, but he's still facing the possible loss of his rule to someone that he believes is trying to take over Middle-earth. And I'm not talking about Aragorn, I'm talking about Gandalf, because he believes that Gandalf is using Aragorn as a puppet, and his distrust of Aragorn, it's not new. He's had it since he was young, and his early use of the Palantir, at least to him, confirmed his suspicions that this Thorongil character that showed up in Gondor, when he was young, and that was Aragorn, of course, and this guy that his father favored was an agent of Mithrandir, which is, of course, Gandalf. So, who would heal his mind? He wouldn't trust Aragorn to heal him. He wouldn't trust Gandalf to heal him. And it's not like Elrond is going to stick around for long. I think Denethor would wind up, just sort of retired, just wind up muttering to himself in a safe environment. It's sad, and, what happened to him actually in the book was probably more merciful, even though it was probably a terrible way to go. But there you have it. I don't think that his sanity could be saved if his life was saved. The destruction of the ring wouldn't have helped him. And like I said, he's not really going to let Aragorn or Gandalf get anywhere near him because he's really just distrustful of these two. So there you have it. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Time Lord Guy, who asks, how did Saruman find Isildur's body? Also, how was it preserved for so long? Well, let's get it out of the way. No one actually claimed that Isildur's body was preserved. The idea that Saruman had found the remains of Isildur comes from the story The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, which is in Unfinished Tales, which at the end goes out of its way to make some things clearer. The first is how a story such as this could be told in universe that had no survivors that witnessed Isildur's death. The High King used the One Ring to escape the disaster and swam away from the carnage. While there was a survivor who would bear news to Elrond, as well as bringing him the shards of Narsil, no one who was present actually witnessed Isildur die. The One Ring betrayed him as he swam, and when he came up out of the water, he was struck in the neck by a poisoned arrow, and the orc who shot him did not even stick around to see who it was that he killed. So Tolkien goes on to say that after the story, that Isildur's death is well-founded surmise. The story of Isildur dying in this fashion is backed up by Gandalf the Grey, who reveals where the One Ring was recovered after getting the story out of Gollum. The question remains, though, if the ring had been discovered, why had the remains of the king not been discovered? And this was answered when Aragorn, after becoming the High King, did a search of Orthanc, which was the tower at Isengard that Saruman had made his home in. In it, he found a secret compartment that contained some of the wizard's greatest treasures, as well as a spot that he had set aside for the One Ring. But the most interesting thing found was the Elendilmere. The Elendilmere was definitely worn by Isildur when he died. It was even stated that he had to wrap something around his head to hide it because its glow was so powerful that even the One Ring could not hide it completely. So it was reasoned that Saruman could only have found it on Isildur's skull, and therefore he must have disposed of the High King's remains in the furnaces of Orthanc. Now keep in mind that the story only refers to bones, not his body. Isildur was not preserved, he was just bones. Considering that he died in shallow water, really just in mud and reeds, he probably was in pretty bad shape when Saruman discovered him. He was probably just bones. But this brings us to the question, when indeed did Saruman find these bones, and how did he know where to look? It's not as if Isildur was not searched for by many others, including the forces of Sauron, but why was it that Saruman found him? Now, it could be that he found him pretty early on. He might have had the idea to search the area before anyone else did, but I don't think that doesn't track to me. That doesn't seem true. The most likely bit is tied up with the fact that there was a misunderstanding by a lot of people in Middle-earth about exactly where Isildur was when he died. Many assumed that he died in the deeper water, and in fact he died in the shallows. Saruman may have just had the idea that everyone else was wrong. I know, imagine that. And happened upon the bones and the Elendilmere, but of course not the ring. Whether this was because it was after the ring was already found, or because the ring was just far away from the High King's body, is unknown, but I think that the latter is more likely. I think that it is most likely that Saruman found Isildur's remains before the ring was discovered, and that he was continuing to search for the ring for a long time after that, but it was wound up being found by Deagle, probably because it was pretty far away from where he died. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of, I guess that's anonymous. It says Anons047. I guess that's an anonymous question. When Gandalf said that Sauron was summoning all evil things to his service, Gollum went to Mordor. Did Bilbo feel the urge to travel too? After all, Gandalf said the ring leaves a mark on its bearers, and Bilbo possessed it for 60 years. No. Absolutely not, no. we can say with complete certainty that at no point during his possession of the One Ring did Bilbo get the urge to suddenly travel to Mordor. For one, he would have mentioned such a thing at some point to one of his friends, such as Gandalf. Failing that, when he was at the Council of Elrond, that would have been a rather good time to bring that up, but it never came up. But the biggest reason, though, is right there in the question itself. Sauron put out a call for evil creatures, and Bilbo's not evil. Of course, the ring does leave a mark on you, but it doesn't make you evil. Gollum was already a bad person. But when the ring, came into his life, he became a lot worse, and it can have subtle corruptions on good people, but we couldn't call Isildur evil, we couldn't call Bilbo evil, or Frodo, or Sam. And now you might want to say, well, but he had it for 60 years, and that's true. But Bilbo at 111 years old isn't evil, and Sauron put out that call only around 10 years after being driven out of Mirkwood. So Bilbo didn't have the ring that long at this point in time. It's also worth mentioning that it actually took Gollum 30 years to travel to Mordor. It's not like he just suddenly turned and walked with purpose towards Mordor, but rather he was influenced in a rather subtle fashion. Bilbo was an adventurer, and the worst thing that he did was he told some little lies. Gollum is a baby-devouring, blood-drinking maniac. There's a big difference there, and even him, he didn't go straight to Mordor. It took him 30 years. So, Sauron calling out evil creatures, he was really looking for soldiers. He wasn't looking for just somebody who was nasty. He was looking for orcs and trolls. He was looking for people that were going to be useful in his wars. So he wasn't looking for the likes of Bilbo. He wasn't even looking for the likes of Gollum, because what use is Gollum going to do him in a war? Of course, he did wind up capturing Gollum, and it started a whole butterfly effect that led to his own downfall. But there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of the Oski Busky, who asks me, can Eru create life without the secret fire? Also, this question actually doesn't make a lot of sense, but I believe that's due to a misunderstanding of what the secret fire is. The secret fire it's also called the imperishable flame. It's the light of creation within Eru, Iluvatar, who is God, and what is necessary to create true life. It is often misrepresented by people that no one can create life without it, but that's not true. The Valar created life all the time, plants and animals. Aula created the dwarves, Melkor created orcs and trolls and dragons, and even minor such as Sauron was able to create things like werewolves and vampires, and possibly even the Olaghai. In the chapter of the Silmarillion of Ali and Yavanna, we see that the dwarves, though, do not have a will of their own when they're first created. They're alive, but they're not really people until Iluvatar makes them people. The likes of Melkor and Sauron get around the only God can create things with will by using necromancy and corrupting or mocking existing creations. That being said, the secret fire isn't like a tool that can be left around and used at a whim. That was the mistake that Melkor made. He wanted the secret fire, and he sought it out within the void, and because he lamented the fact that the void was empty and he wanted to fill it with life, but he came to learn that the secret fire was within Iluvatar himself. The flame burst out of Iluvatar during the creation of Ea, which is the universe, and a small part of it was imparted into the heart of Arda, which is the world. When Gandalf the Grey confronted one of his fallen peers, Durin's Bane, at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, he stated he was a servant of the secret fire, and he's saying in a way that the Balrog will understand, but the members of the Fellowship will not understand, that he is an angel and that he is aligned with Iluvatar, but not Melkor. And this would be like, if the Nazgul said, I'm a servant of the One Ring, he would be stating that he's aligned with Sauron. The One Ring is a part of Sauron, and the secret fire is a part of Iluvatar. So with all that in mind, asking if Iluvatar could create life without the secret fire is sort of like asking, could he speak without a voice? It's a contradiction at the very basic level. So no, of course he couldn't create life without the secret fire. The secret fire is the method of creating life. There isn't another method. I mean, there is another method in the form of what the Valar do, but like I said, they're not creating people. They're not creating, true life where people have free will. They're creating things, plants, animals, and such. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of J. Owens, who asks, why did J.R.R. Tolkien make Gandalf refer to himself as a Maia instead of as an angelic being in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and what was his original intention behind it? So no, that didn't happen. Gandalf didn't refer to himself as a Maia in either The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. The term Maia and its plural form, Maiar, does not appear at all in The Hobbit, and it doesn't appear at all in the main text of The Lord of the Rings, and it's not in the appendix either. As such, Gandalf never refers to himself as a Maia. He refers to himself as a wizard in The Hobbit, and he mentions that there are other wizards out there. Radagast is name-dropped as another of his order. Gandalf even calls him a cousin. And at the end of the book, Saruman is alluded to, but he's never actually mentioned. They just sort of say white wizard. There are greater hints to Gandalf's true nature in The Lord of the Rings, which we see with the fact that, he's been around for a really long time, and he's been called a lot of different names by a lot of different people. All the framework of Gandalf's history is still rooted in the Third Age, but he's clearly been around for a while, and he has connections all over Middle-earth. His true name, Olorin, is mentioned once by Faramir, who states that Gandalf was from the West with a capital W, though the term Maia is never used. A brief accounting of the arrival of the wizards is given in the appendix, which accounts for how Gandalf obtained his Ring of Power. It is logical to assume that Gandalf is not mortal, and he is unlike any other elf with his aged appearance and in his beard, though Círdan the Mariner is aged and has a beard. So, it is possible that some people in Middle-earth thought that Gandalf was a really old elf. The first usage of the term Maia, outside of, letters that Tolkien wrote, which were not published yet, was in the Silmarillion, which was released after Tolkien died. Previously, only people who had privately conversed with him or privately corresponded with Tolkien had heard the term Maia, and the vast majority of his work wasn't published until after he died. The Silmarillion does not, in its main text, we talked about this earlier, draw a connection between the Maia Olorin that's mentioned in the Valaquenta and the wizard Mithrandir that's mentioned in, the Rings of Power. And of course, we know from the Lord of the Rings that Mithrandir is Gandalf. However, in the index, it states Gandalf is the name among men of Mithrandir, one of the Astari, see Olorin. Quoting, and if you look up Olorin, it quotes the character's remembered line to Faramir from the Two Towers. So, it cements the fact that, yes, he's a Maia. Unfinished Tales goes into a lot more detail, though Tolkien's text states that we must assume that the wizards are all Maia, and here explicitly states that the Maia are persons of the angelic order, though not necessarily of the same rank. Christopher Tolkien, his son and the editor, points out in a footnote here that Tolkien, he wrote that we are only assuming that they're Maia, but the Valaquenta says that that they are. So the Silmarillion is where we are definitively told that Gandalf, as well as other characters like Saruman and Radagast and even Sauron, are Maia spirits, and Unfinished Tales clarifies that yes, the Maia are angels. Of course, Tolkien doesn't use the word angel in the direct text because it's not a word that exists in Middle-earth. Rather, they used an Elvish term, Ainu, which means Holy One. And the Ainur are broken into several different categories, all with their own names. You have the 15 greatest of them are the Valar, and the Elvish word Vala means power. But even within the boundaries of the Valar, there is another subcategory. The 8 mightiest of them are called the Aratar, which just translates as the 8, and that's really just, the 8 Valar that the elves revere the most, and they revere them all equally, even though, we know Manwë's the one in charge. And the remainder of the Ainur are the Maiar, which just means the beautiful ones. So the Ainur appear in every version of Tolkien's Legendarium, but in some of the earliest versions, people called the Valar the gods. And he always, when he wrote that, he wrote it with lowercase g, which is really important. This was explained later that these early drafts, the Book of Lost Tales, they exist in universe as the mortal view of how the cosmology works, while the Silmarillion is the elvish version of the same story. Now, some mortals might have referred to the Valar as gods, and they might have worshipped the Valar as gods, and they are in fact demiurgic in nature if you read the Ainur Landala, but Tolkien was very insistent that there's only one god with a capital G, and that's Eru Ilúvatar. And that calling the Valar gods is just a simple mistake. And it's not a mistake that merely comes out of a misunderstanding of how the world works, but out of the lies of Melkor, his satanic figure, who told men that he was God and that he created the world. The term Maia isn't used in the very early drafts, though there were lesser angels that were usually in a few different categories, like mermaids and dryads and spirits. And the mermaids and dryads got dropped. They weren't used again, but the spirits are what became the Maiar. Tolkien did consider keeping those other categories as sort of like a lesser tier, even lower than the Maiar of angels, but then he decided he didn't want to do that. So to answer the question in a very direct fashion, Gandalf never refers to himself as an angel because that's not a word that is used in Middle-earth, but also because it's a secret. People aren't supposed to know that he's an angel. There's a very select few that know who Gandalf is, and that's really just Elrond and Círdan and Galadriel. Even Faramir, who knew the wizard's real name, could not and knew that he came from the West even. He couldn't definitively say that he was told that Gandalf was an angel, because messenger from the West could be an elf, and as we went over earlier, it's weird for an elf to be old, but Círdan was old, Gwyndor was old. It's weird for an elf to have beard. Círdan had a beard, Matan had a beard, so it's just possible, I think there were a lot of people in Middle-earth who were wise, who harbored suspicions as to what the true nature of Gandalf actually was, but they mostly kept that to themselves. They weren't going around talking about it. And I would state, though, that at some point when he's blatantly resurrected and empowered, he comes back as Gandalf the White, I think that removes any doubt for a lot of people. I think at that point people know he's an angel. The cat is sort of out of the bag. His words to Denethor are a bit coded. He calls himself a steward of Middle-earth, and it's sort of like when he called himself a servant of the secret fire when he talked to the Balrog. But in the case of Denethor, it's hard to interpret it any other way, especially knowing that he's died and he's come back to life. And, but getting to this point of knowing all this, just within the strict boundaries of just The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, even without the appendix, it's difficult. But this is on purpose. This story is told by hobbits, and the only hobbit that had any real understanding of how it all works was Bilbo, and he didn't tell anybody. He gave the Silmarillion to Sam at the very, very end of the story when he was going to sail to the West himself. So this knowledge about the angels and everything, it wasn't something that was exactly widespread other than, the elves who kept the records. It wasn't translated into the common speech until Bilbo did that. There you have it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Norma, who asks, is it possible that Gríma poisoned Théoden? Was he responsible for the state that he was in the Two Towers? Théoden's state was mental, and the usage of the word poisoning by Gandalf is metaphorical. First, let's address the film, actually, which I think got the dynamic of the Théoden and Gríma Wormtongue and Saruman relationship wrong. It's responsible for, I think, a lot of misunderstanding about what was actually taking place here. We see Théoden as this extremely decrepit old man, and then Wormtongue is whispering into his ear, and this is more or less exactly correct. We hear from Éomer earlier the line, Saruman has poisoned the mind of the king, which is, of course, using the word poisoned as a metaphor. The wizard didn't feed Théoden a magic potion that made him this way, but rather used his words and his magic to make the king the way he is. Éowyn also directly says to Wormtongue, your words are poison, which cannot be taken literally. Gandalf discovers what is happening with Théoden is possession, in the movie at least. And he's possessed by Saruman, and he uses the term poison again in a simile. He says, I will draw you, Saruman, as poison is drawn from a wound. Once he is successful in exorcising Saruman from the king, Théoden then de-ages to be a middle-aged man, and he becomes hale and hearty again. This would make us wonder why exactly Wormtongue was necessary for this plan, because Saruman had clearly possessed Théoden and had no issue speaking through the king from a distance until he's exorcised, at least. This is meant from a cinematic standpoint to show the majesty of Gandalf the White, who is told as the Grey he has no power there, but then he casts off his grey cloak and he's glowing and he performs the exorcism with such force that Saruman, who is miles away in Orthanc, is knocked off his feet. Now let's talk about the book. Théoden is not possessed by Saruman, but rather he has been gaslit by Gríma Wormtongue, who is working under the instruction of Saruman. It is revealed that Wormtongue in the past was sent to Isengard on some errand and was ensnared into the wizard's service. There's no poison involved, but rather just a mental technique called gaslighting, where one person convinces another to doubt their own sanity and their perception of reality. This is usually done by preying on a person's insecurities, and we see this with Théoden. He's an elderly man who is being convinced that he's weak and senile. The king's mind is dulled by disuse. He's been convinced that he's too old and he's decrepit and he's senile and he can't really do much, and that Wormtongue, his loyal servant, must speak for him. He does not magically age, he's just really that old. Théoden, though, even in his advanced age, is not weak and he's not senile. He's just been bamboozled by cultist tactics. Gandalf simply tells the king he's strong and that if he holds his sword, he'll remember how strong he is. And then Théoden holds his sword and he realizes that Gandalf's telling the truth and that despite his age, he's very strong. And he comes out of his haze and he regains his sharp mind. To put it in modern terms that anyone could understand, Théoden was depressed, and Wormtongue took advantage of his depression by agreeing with the things that the king was saying about himself. He's too old, he's too weak, his mind was going. And it isn't until Gandalf suggests, hey, none of that's true, that Théoden comes out of it. Of course, this had been going on for a really long time. No one gets gaslit overnight. But the recent death of his son Theodred did a lot to hasten the process. So Wormtongue did poison Saruman in a very non-literal sense. And in the book, Gandalf does state this plainly, and I'm going to read you that section here. How far back his treachery goes, who can guess, said Gandalf. He was not always evil. Once I do not doubt that he was the friend of Rohan, and even when his heart grew colder, he found you useful still. But for long now he has plotted your ruin, wearing the mask of friendship until he was ready. In those years Wormtongue's task was easy, and all that you did was swiftly known in Isengard, for your land was open and strangers came and went, and ever Wormtongue's whispering was in your ears, poisoning your thought, chilling your heart, weakening your limbs, while others watched and could do nothing, for your will was in his keeping. So no real magic is needed, not even the voice of Saruman, but his words, spoken by Wormtongue, were enough to take advantage of an elderly man who is suffering from self-doubt. Théoden is his physical frailty is mostly just due to the fact that he's been sitting on the throne moping for a really long time, and the fact that, yeah, he's elderly. And it's important that the king doesn't revert to some younger age, because his later feats at Helm's Deep and Pelennor Fields are even the more impressive because of how old he is. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Eric Mraz, and I've been waiting for someone to ask me about this one. Have you heard of the book Mount Doom by Paul List? If so, what do you think of it? Oh, so I find the concept of the book Mount Doom to be disingenuous. I'm not going to directly say that the insights made by Paul List and Ali Ghaffari, who's the other author, it's kind of weird that you left him out. I'm not going to say that they're incorrect in their insights, but the basic idea of the book is just a grift. For anyone who's unaware, I'm going to read to you the synopsis here, which is how the authors themselves, or at least the publisher, describes the book Mount Doom. J.R.R. Tolkien stated that he wrote his mythology to be enjoyed by readers, and yet that was only the beginning. But there is more to Tolkien's words beyond the fairy tale. For decades, interpreters have guessed at the underlying messages contained within Tolkien's mythology, yet until now, no one has I'm sorry, it's just so silly. No one has pulled together a comprehensive interpretation of the deeper hidden messages within the greatest mythological tales ever told. In Mount Doom, Paul List and Ali Ghaffari show how Tolkien began with the most significant true myth, the creation story from the Book of Genesis, adapted it to the creation of an individual human being, brought in a prophecy about the greatest threat to humanity, idolatry and slavery as a result of over-reliance on digital machinery and artificial intelligence. Tolkien's mythology is his warning to humanity and his hope for the revival of Western civilization. This complete reinterpretation of the Lord of the Rings mythology will forever change how you understand J.R.R. Tolkien and his life's work. Yikes! I award them one entire yike. There's a twofold danger here, and we're going to break it down, and then we're going to decide exactly how predatory this sort of thing is. The first danger is that people like this read The Lord of the Rings with an agenda, thinking that it has to conform to their own thoughts. They grasp onto things like Tolkien is Catholic, and they go from there, willfully ignoring the book's foreword, in which John Ronald Reuel Tolkien himself states that the story is not topical and it's not allegorical. There's no hidden meanings, just what you see here. He does state that the story is open to literary applications. You can take the obviously stated lessons in the book and apply them to any single point of your life, but these applications of meaning are done by the reader, not by the author. In a letter that he wrote to Peter Hastings, and where Hastings had accused Tolkien of writing The Lord of the Rings as bad theology, Tolkien states that, well, whether or not that's true is not relevant, because he never set out to write theology. He wrote literature. What he did find the book to have a Catholic bend, he is quick to point out that it wasn't his intention, but something that he did unconsciously, and then he leaned into it a little bit once he realized it. The sole allusion to Catholic dogma in The Lord of the Rings is the lembas bread being a stand-in for the Eucharist, which he describes as sort of a somewhat clumsy allusion that he indulged in. Tolkien's work is not theology, it's mythology. It's not dogmatic, it's literary. It's not allegorical, it's didactic. Understanding what these words mean and the differences between them is on the burden of the reader. And it's not important at all to enjoy The Lord of the Rings, but when one makes it one's business to write about Tolkien, like I do, one must shoulder a responsibility to understand what these words mean and what the differences are, and most importantly, why Tolkien was so insistent in defining his work in such ways. Tolkien wanted the reader to have the freedom to interpret his work as they wish. And this is a freedom that people like List and Ghaffari have. However, when you start telling people who are sitting there wondering what is the hidden meaning, The responsibility there is to either point people at the author's own words in the foreword, where it's stated what the meanings are not hidden, or to just straight up tell them, the Lord of the Rings doesn't have a hidden meaning. Though you can find the thoughts of the author spoken plainly by many characters throughout the work, what it all means to you is up to how you choose to apply his words. This brings us to the layperson who might just skip forward and to get to the story and enjoy it, and that's perfectly fine. I'm serious, no shade on anybody who grabs, here it is, the Fellowship of the Ring, and they say, what is this, the prologue? I'm not going to read that. What is this, the forward? I'm not going to read that. On Hobbit's Finding of the Ring? I read The Hobbit, I don't need any of this. Here we are, chapter 1, A Long Expected Party. That's actually page 29 on my copy, so there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's fine. That's just getting to the story. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. It doesn't mean that when you start asking me, what is the allegory? What is the hidden meaning? I'm not going to point to say, well, read the intro. It tells you right there that there is no hidden meaning and there is no allegory. So I can't get it out of my head that people who claim to have the answers to the secret riddles are preying on this, that people don't read the intro and they're wondering, I wonder if this all has some kind of secret meaning, and they're going to say, and I know what it is. I can tell you what Tolkien was really saying, and offer my interpretation as the definitive one. Buy my book. Of course, that could just be a marketing ploy. People are more likely to buy a book that claims to have answers rather than a book that claims to have theories, especially since most people don't even understand what a theory really is. If you want understanding of lore or linguistics and literary themes, you come to somebody like me and ask me the question, or any of the other wonderful writers out there like Matt and Sid and Laurel and Dutch and all the people in Quora. I'll give you an answer. I'll tell you what my interpretation is, and I'll make it clear that it is my interpretation, and that you'll feel free to have your own interpretation. I'm sorry, I've just been waiting for somebody to ask this question for so long about this stupid book. If you want to go to a lower tier of understanding, and you're like, well, I want to know what's canon. Well, there are other people that answer that sort of question, and I know quite a bit of them on Quora, and you can go over there and ask, and you'll get an answer if you care about that sort of thing. But if you want to get in the author's head, it's best to go to the source. Now, I can help you compile the sources. There are thousands of pages in the history of Middle-earth, and that's only one bit of it. But if you want to get to what Tolkien is all about, just pick up a copy of the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm good for telling you what he thought about a specific matter and then citing where that came from. But if you want to understand where he's coming from, just in general, that's the book you want to read. Not Mount Doom, the letters. That's his words directly from his mouth. Not some book telling you that he's writing a prophecy about generative AI and how it relates to worshiping idols. It's all up to you guys, who are just offering your thoughts and sharing with everyone else. I'm sorry. It's up to you guys whether these authors are, they're offering their thoughts and sharing it with everyone, how they apply to Tolkien's works. But are they claiming to be messengers of his one true message, and you're just too simple to grasp it? I can't help but think, yeah, that's what they're doing. Everything about this book screams to me it's just a grift. It's just a buy my book and I'm going to tell you the secrets that you never thought you needed to know, and that they're basically going to write this whole thing about how Tolkien prophesized about things that he never would have conceived of, like generative AI, and how he's warning us all and blah 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 blah. I'm telling you, even just going through the reviews of Mount Doom on Amazon is really hilarious, because you get people who have clearly been taken advantage of, and they're like, I never knew Tolkien was saying all this. And, well, yeah, because he wasn't. So there you have it. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of the Oski Boski, who asks me, was Sauron aware that Eru destroyed Númenor? Who told him? He knew, because he was there. Sauron didn't need anyone to tell him that it was Iluvatar that destroyed Númenor. This was an event that he experienced firsthand. Not my favorite, I'll talk about that later, but one of my favorite Tolkien jokes is that Sauron took a biblical cataclysm directly to the face. And that's, of course, what I'm talking about here. We're even told what his thoughts were when he goes down into the abyss with everything else. I'm going to read you the relevant passage from the Akalabeth. For Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru had laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenorians and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he had heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again he had laughed when he had heard the thunder of the storm. And a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever, he was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat in his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh. And though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor, that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice. So, we see here that Sauron, in goading Pharazôn into going in force to the Undying Lands, he had no idea that it was going to go as far as it went. Sauron knew that they didn't stand a chance against the elves, much less the angels, the Maia and the Valar that dwell in the west, and he figured the situation had taken care of itself. He goes from mirth to fear pretty quickly, though of course he survives, just now robbed of his ability to make himself appear beautiful. That being said, he knows very well that only Iluvatar could have done such a thing. The Akalabeth wasn't just the sinking of Númenor, it was the breaking of the world and its reshaping. The world was a disk, a flat plane, though globed in a firmament. Iluvatar didn't just smite Númenor, he took the world and he reshaped it into a sphere, and he removed the Undying Lands physically from the world, leaving a secret path that could only be sailed off of Middle-earth by those who were welcome in the Undying Lands, and anyone else who sailed to the west would just circle around to the east. Sauron, who helped sing the universe into existence, and he was there when it all happened, he knows very well that only one being has the power to do such a thing. And aside from this, even if the Valar had that kind of power to do that kind of thing, he knows that they wouldn't do that. And that's why he really should have applied some critical thinking here. When Manwë got tired of all the devil worship and human sacrifice that was going on in Númenor, he did the biggest show of force that he was comfortable with. He struck the Temple of Melkor with lightning. And this didn't even help a little bit. It made it a lot worse, actually. Instead of destroying the devil-worshipping cult, Manwë made it worse. Because though he destroyed the roof of the temple, Sauron basically climbed up to the top and put himself in harm's way, and Manwë did not strike Sauron down. And this was seen by the king's men that Sauron was every bit what he said, Melkor incarnate. It solidified their faith in Sauron, and is what gave him the sway to tell the king that he could claim the Undying Lands for his own and gain immortality. If Sauron had, thought critically about all of this, he would have thought, well, if Manwë wouldn't even strike me, he's not going to wipe out the king's fleet. He's going to call upon a higher power. Of course, Sauron, though injured greatly and weakened by the Akalabeth, was triumphant, so it turned out his way anyway. He wished for Númenor to be gone, and it was gone in a much more final way than he had hoped for. Of course, he wound up pretty upset that there were survivors, the followers of Elendil, who, when the Akalabeth happened, were already en route to Middle-earth. And they would continue their culture in places like Arnor and Gondor, and that really aggravated him. But that's a different story. That's the Lord of the Rings. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of, I hope I'm saying it right, Famita Katernani, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, when Bilbo asked Frodo to show him the ring one final time, why did he have such a visceral reaction? So this is actually a film question, not a book question, but we can still examine it from both sides here. Bilbo lunging forward and making a face like that can only be described as cinematic storytelling, something that didn't happen that way in the book, but gives us the same information and gives us a little thrill. Obviously, it worked out as a bit of a jump scare. The mild-mannered and elderly Bilbo suddenly lunges at Frodo and looks like something out of a mid-tier horror movie, and that plays into Peter Jackson's strengths because he was previously known as more of a horror guy than anything else before The Lord of the Rings. While we have not yet seen Gollum at this point, the message is clear. The ring has a nasty effect on people, especially people who hold on to it for a long time. Bilbo hasn't exactly become like Gollum, but he has a bit of a Gollum moment there, and it's not his first. Bilbo had channeled Gollum earlier, and this scene was pretty much done exactly like it was in the book, where he called the ring his precious, and he was even called out on that by Gandalf. This is meant to show the terrible effect of the ring, and why we should, what we should take away from the scene isn't how Bilbo looked and how he acted in that moment where he lunges like that, but how he looked and he acted just after that, a tired old hobbit who unknowingly held onto an evil artifact with the soul of a fallen angel in it for decades, and even after having given it up, he's still enamored of it, and he feels horrible about the situation. This also plays into an idea for the Two Towers that was actually not used. In the Two Towers, Sam was supposed to have a vision of Frodo becoming possessed of the One Ring in a similar way and transforming into something a bit more like Gollum. And I put the picture up here. We can see Elijah Wood in the makeup for the scene, but it didn't get used. It wasn't even included in the extended edition. I think it would have worked, though, especially considering that in the book, Sam has visions like this. Not this particular vision, but he has several that involve Frodo, seeing Frodo as this stern, white-robed figure holding a wheel of fire. So it wouldn't be much of a stress for him to have a vision like that. That being said, the purpose of the scene is to impress upon us how awful the ring truly is. And this is kind of important, as we get loads of Boromir claiming that, hey, maybe we shouldn't destroy it. And it's important not to fall into this whole Boromir is logical nonsense. He's 100% wrong, and he's basing his opinion partly on obstinance, but mostly on emotion. The audience has to really feel how evil the ring is. In the book, there is, in fact, a scene like this, but it's not Bilbo who goes through a transformation, and he certainly doesn't lunge at anybody, but the change comes over Frodo. Frodo sees Bilbo as a creature when he asks to see the ring, and then he's suddenly filled with horror and revulsion, and he gets the urge to hit Bilbo, and Bilbo has not transformed, but rather the ring is giving Frodo a vision of Bilbo as an evil creature trying to take the ring from him, and Frodo reacts in a way that the ring would want him to react. I mean, he doesn't actually hit him, but he reacts in horror and revulsion. We know that the ring has become precious to Frodo as early on as the second chapter of the book, where Frodo claims that he wants to see it destroyed, and Gandalf basically is like, hey, prove it, throw it in your fireplace. And Frodo has already had it demonstrated to him that the fireplace isn't going to hurt the ring. It's not even going to warm it up. And still, he's unable to chuck it in. Not only does this show that the ring has a hold on him, but it skillfully foreshadows exactly what's going to happen when Frodo does enter Mount Doom and stands at Samath Naur. The ring, making others appear as monsters to avoid passing hands or even being touched by another, is used later on in the book as well, when Frodo sees Sam as an orc, when Sam suggests sharing the burden. The ring had already spent a little bit of time with Sam, and it knew, well, it's going to take a long time to crack that nut, so I definitely want to stay with Frodo because he's been succumbing for quite some time. This, of course, was to their benefit because Sam was able to retain what strength he had and carry Frodo across the plateau of Gorgoroth. It's important to know that the weight of the ring, it feels real, but it's not real weight. Frodo feels weighted down when he has the ring, and when Sam had the ring, he felt, that it was dreadfully heavy, but then he had no issue carrying Frodo, who was carrying the ring. It's a spiritual weight, not a physical weight. The only time that the ring doesn't try this trick is when Frodo hands it to Tom Bombadil. He only had like a little pang of reluctance, and then Bombadil doesn't suddenly look sinister. He just asks for the ring. He plays with it for a little bit, and then he hands it back to Frodo. And Frodo is so amazed at how the ring has no effect on Bombadil and how easily old Tom gave it back to him that he even wonders if Tom somehow switched it for a fake, and he puts it on to prove that it was the same one, which is where we see that, Merry and Pippin and Sam, they can't see Frodo when he's wearing the ring, but Tom can. Tom has no ambitions to prey on, and the ring has no sway over him. This is also why Gandalf rejects the idea of giving it to Tom for safekeeping. Instead of destroying it, he won't Tom won't see it as important for very long. He's probably just going to give it to somebody as a gift. And besides keeping the ring safe, doesn't stop Sauron. All right, let's move on to the final question. Our final question comes in by the request of Keith Wyman, who asks, are Tolkien's elves like humans, where they treat their sons and daughters like children, even after they're thousands of years old? I think this is a really good question. I've never heard something like this before. It's really interesting, and it's the kind of question that we could really only use surmise to answer. We don't actually get a lot of elf-parent interactions in Tolkien's works. The most prominent relationship like that in The Lord of the Rings is between Elrond and his children, Arwen, Elladan, and Elrohir. And Elrond doesn't even really interact that much with his children in the scenes that we're privy to. It's mostly, how they interact with Aragorn, especially since Arwen is his lover, and Elladan and Elrohir are close friends of his. In the Silmarillion, the most prominent parental relationships are varying degrees of toxic. Feanor basically makes his 7 sons into a murderous cult, even making them reiterate their oath upon his own death. But we aren't told if he, how he treats them as people, if he treats them like adults or if he treats them like kids. In a proposed but unfinished revision, Tolkien was going to have Feanor murder one of his sons, but I guess that's pretty messed up, but it doesn't really indicate whether he saw him as like a child or like an adult. Feanor's relationship with his own parents is very needy and toxic as well. He can't deal with his father remarrying. He hates his half-siblings, especially Fingolfin. But once again, we aren't told much about how Finwë regards his son as an adult, though he certainly loves him a lot. We don't get moments between Galadriel and her father Finarfin. We don't get anything between Galadriel and Celeborn and their daughter Celebrian. It's just not an aspect that is greatly experienced. One of my favorite jokes is Elrond has 2 dads and he turned out okay, and they were psychopathic murderers. Elrond did not know his actual father. He was raised by the Feanorians, Mathros and Maglor. And it should be mentioned that when his dads died, he was in his 50s, which is sort of like an elvish adolescence. He wouldn't meet his real parents until he's thousands of years old and he sails to the west. And maybe if they babied him a little bit, I wouldn't really blame them. They haven't seen him since he was an infant. That being said, what we know of the elvish life cycle is mostly found in the book The Nature of Middle-earth, and there we learn that the elves are physically mature at 50 years old, and they're considered adults when they're around 100 years old. Their infancy is actually really short. They're not babies for very long, not nearly as long as mortals are, but then they remain children for a long time, and they remain adolescents for a long time. Despite our lack of examples of direct conversations between adult elves and their thousands of years, old age with their parents, we can surmise strongly that adult elves are probably treated as fully autonomous adults by their parents. Celebrion's a good example. She traveled wherever she wished without, Galadriel and Celeborn telling her what she should do. They didn't seem to have an issue with her leaving her in charge of Lothlorien when they traveled, which is, when Elrond came to speak to Celeborn and he first met his future wife. Elrond's the same. He lets his children do whatever they are going to do. When Aragorn comes to him, 20-year-old mortal guy, saying, hey, I'm in love with your daughter, Elrond simply states, well, you need to make yourself worthy of her. And that means becoming the king. Arwen goes where she wants to, and she spends a lot of time living in Lothlorien with her grandparents, and Elrond's sons are running all over Middle-earth doing all sorts of different things. So I would state that there might be exceptions, but generally it seems to me that elves treat their adult children as adults. I think that with real people, it's a bit different because we're mortal. We're not here forever. Our children are always going to be children to us on some level, and one day we're not going to be here, and then they will be here. Hopefully that's what you hope for, at least. And the dynamic is different. Elves almost never die in a permanent sort of way. At best, they're held in Mandos for a very long time, or even forever, but they're still not really dead. Luthien is an exception by divine intervention, and there are the half-elves who had a choice, and they chose mortality, like Arwen. But for the most part, you'll be around forever. Your parents are around forever. Your grandparents are around forever. This isn't talked about a lot, but somewhere in the Undying Lands, in Valinor, Eldamar, or somewhere, the very first elf, Eamon, is still alive. And I'd like to imagine that he's sitting on a porch, whittling, or doing something like that while everything else is happening around him, and he's just content that his descendant Ingwa has the whole king of all the elves thing under control, and he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. So, there. That's my thoughts on that. That was our final question. I really enjoyed the questions for today, but now we're going to get to the questions that I asked you guys, the quiz results for the past week. So let's take a look at those. And finally, let's review the quizzes. We didn't get to have a quiz review last episode because I was coming off of like a 5-week gap due to not having a computer. And though there were quizzes that were like sort of left in the ether when everything shut down, that they were scheduled and still coming out, we wound up reviewing those on one of my lives. So if you're looking for those, just look back on the lives and look for like basically the first one that I think, I don't know, did I do that one from my phone? I don't think I did. I think it was like one that I didn't do from my phone, but it was like right at the beginning of that sort of era. Anyway, we have like 7 new quizzes here to go over, and we're gonna just see how you guys did. So in this first one, here we are. Which Old Norse volume are the majority of the dwarves from The Hobbit names adapted from? Now, all of the names of the dwarves, except for Thorin, were adapted from a big Norse poem called the Edda, but which volume of it is it? And the answer is actually here, Voluspa, which we have a plurality here. 38% of you went for that, so that's pretty good there. Another name that was actually taken from the Voluspa was actually Gandalf. Gandalfir was one of the dwarves in the Voluspa. However, they wound up, that was actually the name of one of the dwarves in the earliest version of, The Hobbit, and then later on, the wizard, who was named Bladderthin at that point, was renamed Gandalf, and then the dwarf that was Gandalf, the very important dwarf, was renamed Thorin Oakenshield, which was a name that Tolkien came up with on his own. He didn't really like the idea that he had basically taken all these names from the Voluspa, and he later regretted doing that, but then he explained it as, well, these are just sort of translations of the names that were used, and that Old Norse sort of represents the language that was spoken in Rovanian in the past. So, there you have it. Moving on to this next quiz, which of these elves was not present during the Council of Elrond. I thought this one was a slam dunk. I think most of you guys, I was surprised that anybody, 2% of people actually said that Legolas was not at the Council of Elrond. Of course, he was there. He was the one that told the story of how Gollum had escaped from prison in Mirkwood. Glorfindel, of course, was there. He had a few ideas. He was the one who thought, hey, maybe we should chuck the ring into the ocean. And Gandalf thought that was a bad idea. Galdor was there as well. He was a messenger from Círdan. Ecthelion was not there. Ecthelion is in the Undying Lands. He died in Gondolin during the Fall of Gondolin, so of course he would have been re-embodied over in the Undying Lands. And unlike Glorfindel, who also died during the fall, or shortly after, I should say, the Fall of Gondolin, when he had to fight a Balrog, he did not get sent back to Middle-earth. So there we have it there. But the overwhelming majority, 73%, of people voted for Ecthelion. I'm saying, I threw Legolas in there as like, this is an easy one that you're absolutely not going to vote for. And I tend to think that it's not that 2% of people were, just really thought that. Maybe they thought, oh, this is some sort of trick. Maybe he was in Rivendell, but not actually at the council, but he actually was at the council. Here's our next one. This was a fun one for me. Which of these names is not the name of a Baggins? We got Ponto, Porto, Pongo, and Polo. And I kind of predicted this would happen. The majority here, 52%, went for Polo. There is a Polo Baggins. Pongo is not the name of Baggins. It is the name of one of the characters from the 101 Dalmatians. It is the name of a dog. Some other people were talking about it's like a classification of like an orangutan or something like that, and that has nothing to do with anything. That's not where I took the name from. I took the name Pongo from another book, specifically because it sounded like a Baggins name. Here's our next one. What is the Cirthus Daeron? And I'm pleasantly surprised to see that we got a good plurality here. People got it right. It is a standardized runic alphabet that was created in Doriath by an elf who was named Daeron, and he created this, or he didn't really create the runic alphabet, but he standardized it. He made the version of it that everybody used from then on, and these runes are still used in the Third Age. So there you have it there. Our next one here, which of these things caused Gondor's kin strife? And the majority here, people said it was two cousins, both claiming that they were heirs to the throne, and that's sort of like almost the truth, but it's not quite the truth. The truth is that there was a splinter faction who did not want a foreign-born king. The king was going to be this guy Eldacar, and as the current king was sort of aging and they realized he was going to go soon, and they're like, wait a minute, this guy's son was not born in Gondor, therefore he's garbage. Which is not true, but one of his cousins did indeed lead a coup after him. He wasn't claiming that he was the true heir, but he was basically claiming that Eldacar was no good due to not having been born in Gondor, and this was a civil war that was known as the kin strife. Thankfully, none of the princes of Gondor ever joined Sauron, although there were plenty of men of Gondor that joined Sauron. They wound up, a lot of them, going to Umbar and becoming the Corsairs here. Two princes fighting over a woman. It was just sort of a joke answer that I put in there because I was thinking of the song Two Princes. It had nothing to do with anything. Our next one here, which region in Beleriand had an almost identical shape to Mordor? 46% of you got it right. That is Hithlum. The other answer that a lot of people went towards is Dorthonion, but Dorthonion is more completely enclosed in mountains, and it's more oval shaped, whereas Mordor is sort of just like a letter E almost, where it's like a C, but then there's that extra bit. So like the letter E, Hithlum is pretty much if you took Mordor, made it bigger, and then sort of rotated it diagonally. And considering the fact that it's very close to where we believe Angband was, which was of course Morgoth's fortress, and considering the fact that we have very good reason to believe that Morgoth created Mordor in the first age, we have to believe that this is very much on purpose, that he just likes that sort of configuration of these boxy sort of mountain ranges that are forming natural fortifications while leaving one side open to deal with like trade routes with allies and things like that. And here's our final quiz. Which of these Tolkien characters do not have an asteroid or other celestial body named after them? And this is the first time that the correct answer is in last place. There has never been a asteroid or celestial body named after Galadriel. There are, in fact, I think there is a like a hill on one of the moons of I want to say Saturn that is named Galadriel, but it's just a hill. But there are asteroids and celestial bodies named after Bilbo and Elmare and Sauron and Earendil and a whole bunch of others, including one that's called Tolkien, but not a Galadriel. They haven't as of yet done it. There's a Varda. They haven't as of yet named an asteroid or a dwarf planet or anything, or a star Galadriel, which is kind of a shame. They really should, since she's such a great character. But yeah, a lot of you guys thought, wow, of course there has to be a Galadriel. I'm not going to vote for that. And most of them went for Sauron. And there is, in fact, a Sauron floating out there. You would think that there's a Morgoth as well. Although I think Morgoth's not a celestial, but I'd have to look into it. I think the Morgoth is a river or something on one of the moons of Jupiter or something like that. If you go to like Wikipedia and you look up like things named after Tolkien characters, you'll find like a whole list of celestial bodies and other things in astronomy and a lot of other things in the world, and it's actually really fascinating. But yeah, not Galadriel, unfortunately. Anyway, guys, that is our quiz review, and that is the end of the video. I thank you guys for sticking out throughout the whole thing and having fun with me. And if you got through the whole video and you haven't subscribed already, why not? Why did you watch the whole thing and then not subscribe? I think you should hit the button now. Subscribe now. If you haven't already, hit the like button. Leave a comment if there's a hype button, if that's a thing. If you see that, hit it. We'll find out what it does. And, you know, there you go. We'll see you guys next time. Consider membership as well. Membership really helps me out. And you get to see all the videos early and some other great perks. So, see you guys next time.